Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Wednesday, May 26th. The Washington Post reported late yesterday that Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance has convened a special grand jury to decide whether to bring criminal charges against former President Donald Trump, other executives at his company, or the company itself. According to the Post, the move indicates that after a more than 2-year investigation with a lengthy legal battle for Trump's tax returns, Vance believes he may have found evidence of a crime somewhere in the Trump organization. The panel will sit for 3 days a week for the next 6 months, longer than a traditional New York grand jury assignment, people familiar with the matter told the paper. These sources say the Democratic prosecutors, investigators are scrutinizing Trump's business practices before he was president, including whether the value of specific properties in the Trump organization's real estate portfolio were manipulated in a way that defrauded banks and insurance companies, and if any tax benefits were obtained illegally through unscrupulous asset valuation. They're also looking into untaxed compensation to the company's chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, who investigators are trying to pressure into cooperating against his boss, the Post previously reported. A lawyer for Weisselberg, declined to comment, but former President Trump issued a lengthy statement last night calling the grand jury, quote, a continuation of the greatest witch hunt in American history, somewhat confirming that it's happening. The Trump organization has denied any wrongdoing. Let's bring in one of the reporters behind this story, investigative reporter for the Washington Post, David Fahrenthold. Also with us, former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade and professor at law at Georgetown University, Paul Butler is with us.
David, thanks so much for being with us and for bringing this reporting to us. What else can you tell us about this story?
Well, we don't really know exactly who the target of this investigation is. We know the Trump organization is the target. We don't know who they're going to present indictments against. What it does show us, as you said earlier, is that this has moved to a different phase. After spending more than 2 years gathering evidence, they're at the phase where the DA wants to go in front of a grand jury and start presenting that evidence, marshaling that evidence toward proving probable cause for a crime. They have a long time to do it. They have 6 months to do it. But that's where they think they are. And that to us was a very surprising and notable development.
Any idea why this one is 6 months long, why this grand jury is a little longer than most grand juries?
What we were told is that when you're dealing with white-collar cases, fraud cases, public corruption cases, where there's lots of moving pieces, you want a grand jury that can sit long enough to hear all of that. They're probably going to hear a lot more evidence than an actual jury in a courtroom would. So you want people to come back and hear all the pieces. I imagine in this case they're going to hear from appraisers, accountants, taxing authorities, all kinds of people. Because you remember, there's different pieces of this, and every little piece of it is sort of complicated. So they're going to hear from a lot of folks making a lot of complicated cases one after the other.
David, more than anybody else in journalism, you have completely immersed yourself in all things Trump as it pertains to financing, both before he was in the White House and while he was in the White House. What do you suspect? And of course, I've made it very clear to my audience that I absolutely, I loathe the fact that for the past 5 years, everybody, there's a leak and everybody immediately thinks somebody's going to jail. I ask this question not presupposing that Donald Trump is going to even be indicted, but I'm just asking you, as somebody who knows this material better than anybody else in journalism, where do you suspect investigators are going to be looking? Where have they been looking based on your reporting? And what do you believe is that issue for Vance and his team to decide whether a charge is brought or not?
Well, we know from other public filings and from subpoenas we've reviewed that the DA is interested at least in the same transactions that the New York Attorney General has been talking about, which is transactions where Trump valued his assets quite high in order to impress lenders and have people think he's a good credit risk, and then devalue those assets, in some cases perhaps too much, in order to save on his taxes, to get tax breaks from conservation easements. And then in one case, he got $100 million plus worth of debt forgiven. And there's questions about whether he actually paid the proper income tax on that forgiven debt. But you have to remember, there's a whole universe out there of evidence we haven't seen yet, which is from Trump's tax returns. No one before Cy Vance had ever gotten a hold of that much information about Trump's finances. And from the little bit that I've seen of tax returns prepared by Donald Trump's folks, there were a lot of problems in the little bit that I've seen. So there could be a lot more problems in those millions of pages. The key for the DA, if they're going to go after... Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The key, if they're going to go after Donald Trump personally, is to prove intent. And this is a complicated case. Trump, I'm sure, is going to say, I relied on my lawyers, I relied on my accountants. They have to find statements, witnesses, documents that show Trump knew what he was doing and did it anyway.
So there's one piece of property that I don't think most of us are familiar with that keeps coming up north of the city. Talk about that property and why that seems to always come up in these stories and in investigations into Donald Trump's financing.
You're right. I spent a lot of time covering the Trump Organization. This is one of the most obscure properties called Seven Springs. It's a big estate up in Westchester County, New York. It used to actually be owned by the people who owned the Washington Post years ago. And it's a huge estate, but Trump hasn't gone there for years and years and years. In fact, we've been told it's used to store old furniture. But it's gotten Trump in a lot of trouble because in 2015, Trump got what's called a conservation easement on that property. He said, I'm not going to develop this into houses. I have the right to, but I'm not going to. So I want a tax break for giving up those development rights. And he got a $21 million tax break. The problem was he didn't actually have the permissions to build those houses, and he might never have gotten them. He fought them for years and hadn't gotten the permissions he wanted. So the question is, did he lie to taxing authorities? Did he exaggerate the value that there was in that land in order to get that giant tax break? That's one of the properties that seems to be under scrutiny by both the Attorney General and the DA.
Yeah, he bought that place, Joe, in 1995 for $7.5 million, appraised in 2015 for $56.5 million. Barbara McQuade, put on your prosecutor's hat here for a moment. Just take a step back for our viewers and explain what it takes for a prosecutor to convene and impanel a grand jury. It would appear Cy Vance believes there was a crime committed. Again, to underline what Joe said, we don't know who. We don't know if it's Donald Trump or someone else in his orbit. But what would it take to seat a grand jury in this case?
Well, a grand jury has both a charging function and an investigative function. So as long as Cy Vance believes that he has credible allegations that a crime may have been committed, that would be a sufficient basis to convene this grand jury. But I think it's a significant step because we've long known that Cy Vance has documents, and so he has now likely completed his review of those documents. If there were nothing there, nothing to suggest to him that a crime has been committed, there'd be no need to convene this grand jury. So the fact that he has says to me that he has found sufficient evidence in those documents to believe he should take that next step. And in New York, it's necessary to present all of the evidence before a grand jury. It's not enough to rely on hearsay the way it is in federal court. So they need to hear from enough witnesses to be convinced that there's probable cause that a crime has occurred. That could take some time. We talked about the 6 months to see the documents and to hear from the witnesses. But it also performs that investigative function. And so it could be necessary to put people before the grand jury to compel their testimony, either with a subpoena or for witnesses who may be reluctant to work out deals with them, some cooperation deal where they'll get a recommendation of leniency in exchange for coming in and testifying. All of those things are likely to occur in the next 6 months.
So, Paul Butler, what's a reasonable expectation in terms of a timeline here? We know these grand juries sit and they hear evidence for other cases as well. They're not just seated strictly to hear the investigation evidence into the Trump Organization. So what might we expect here? When may we hear that there's charges? What could we learn soon?
Grand juries are secret. There's no real way of knowing, Willie, except that this grand jury has been impaneled for 6 months, but that could be extended. So early in an investigation, grand juries, as Barbara said, subpoena evidence. Now it sounds like this is at the stage where the district attorney believes there's probable cause to charge something like the Trump Organization or someone with a crime. And often with corporate crimes, people at the top insulate themselves so the middle managers get blamed. The interesting thing about the Trump organization is reportedly all of the decision-making was consolidated at the top with Donald Trump Sr., Donald Trump Jr., Erica, Ivanka, and Alan Weisselberg. And so those are the people who the grand jurors will be focused on. They probably won't hear from any of them, but other witnesses and documents will try to tell their story.
Right. Professor Butler, if you study Michael Cohen's description of how Trump operates, he often doesn't say much, but he indicates in somewhat of an unspoken language as to what his middle managers should do, and then they end up shouldering a lot of the problems. Explain, as if you're explaining to your students, what will happen in this grand jury and how Weisselberg could either be a focus of the investigation or could be useful against former President Donald Trump.
So the prosecutors will use the grand jury to tell a story, and they'll have a lot more evidence than would be admissible if this were a regular trial. And in the grand jury, you don't have to present any of the defense. So it will be both a pro-prosecution story, but also one designed to see if this case goes to trial and we charge the Trump organization, we charge individuals, then is that an airtight case? Because, Mika, you don't charge the organization of the former president, and you certainly don't charge the former president or his family members with the crime unless it's a slam dunk, unless you know you can win.